I'm going to go through a few slides for the first part of this session before we then go into Q&A. What will the slides look like and what will we cover? So we've pretty much split it into two sections. One which is to be able to show you again or revisit the process that we've done to date, and also to understand how we assess our applications. So just again to revisit those eight criteria that we have that we work through as an organisation and as assessors for each of the grant rounds. And then to go into areas where application scores tended to drop and where they tended to be stronger, and they were the fine margins in which helped us decide which projects move on to the next stage, and then open it up for question and answer. So again, as I said, this round, as most of our rounds are, very competitive. We get some excellent applications that come through. And actually the money that we have for our grant rounds really doesn't go that far in terms of the type of projects that or the number of projects we're able to fund and the types of evaluations that we fund alongside those. So we genuinely have some really tough decisions that we have to make. Where are we at so far, and what does that look like in the process for grant round 2? So as you'll probably remember, we opened applications towards the end of September, and we then had a deadline of the 1st of December. We ended up with 130 applications that actually came through our system, or over 130 applications that came through our system. And we processed all of those applications in the same way in terms of our assessment process, which is on the screen for you now, but I'll briefly run through it as a reminder. Once the deadline had closed in terms of the applications, we went through a series of assessment processes with our teams. So the first assessment process with my team, so I'm head of programs, and the team that sits under me is a team of 4 program managers, and we have support from internal team members as well. And the team undergo extensive training to be able to do the assessments, and then they will be assigned specific applications, and we go through that assessment process. We have a number of checks and balances within that process as well. Once we've gone through those first set of assessments, we have an internal panel. And in that panel, we essentially have what we call a data-led approach. So we work with one of our sister organisations, which is the Social Investment Bank, to help us put all of the assessment scores into a dashboard, into a Power BI dashboard, to help us create what we call a long list. So in this particular instance, we created a long list from 130, we brought it down to 39 applications that we decided that were applications that we were really, really interested in, that we needed to narrow down further. And we did that as part of our internal panel with this particular dashboard. Those 39 then went on to our evaluation managers. Our evaluation managers then reassessed those 39, again against the same 8 criteria, but through the lens of evaluation rather than the programs team. And again, we went through a data-led approach through our internal panel to determine who would we invite to interview and what would that look like. The interviews took place. We had 14 projects that went through to interview. And so we undertook those interviews, and following on from those interviews, we write up what we call a decision report form and go through a number of internal panels, but also go to our grants and evaluation committee to present those decision report forms and determine who we would like to invite to the next stage, which is our co-design stage. So we're currently, as you can see, around about halfway between interviews and GECO committee stage. So working through those with those organisations who we intend to take through to co-design. So that's the process, and that's kind of where we're at the minute. Happy to talk more later if it's of interest to you, so you're aware of what happens during co-design and post co-design. But what I'll move on to now is really just to give you a bit of a refresher, because I recognise some of your faces, and I think a number of you actually attended the workshops that we delivered, or the application workshops we delivered last year. And what you'll remember is we did give an overview of our assessment criteria and what that looked like. So I'm going to run through how we assess and what that looks like again, just to make sure that you're familiar with it, because it may be you want to ask questions against that. So We have 8 assessment criteria, and they're split into 2 core areas. So one is what we call a great plan. And if I just move forward, you'll see the other is strong capability to deliver the plan. So what do we mean by a great plan? Well, there's 4 key elements to a great plan that are really key to us. The first thing is what we call a worthwhile outcome. Now, that worthwhile outcome is an outcome that strongly aligns to outcomes of interest. We have an outcomes framework, and on that framework, we have a set of what we call primary and secondary outcomes. Primary outcomes are the ones that we're most interested in, but secondary outcomes are also of interest to us. And for each of the grant rounds, we go through determining which are the most pertinent outcomes that would allow us to learn the most for that grant round, and therefore the outcomes that we should give priorities to as part of our application process. And as part of that, we're really keen to ensure that I guess the projects and the outcomes are really aiming to change things that are likely to reduce crime and violence, even if that is further upstream or downstream, depending on the grant round. Actually, all emanates in us being able to reduce the risk of young people being involved in violence. Then the next question we look at is, okay, so we've identified worthwhile outcomes. Now we need to understand, is the project or the activities that make the project up, if they are delivered in the way that they're intended to be delivered as presented within the application form, what is the likelihood, if they're delivered well, for them to change the outcome, to ensure that outcome is achieved or addressed? So part of that is understanding, firstly, having clarity on what the project actually is and what the core components of delivery are. Understanding the links between those activities and the outcome. So do we have any evidence? Is there any information on the likelihood of those activities leading to the change in the outcome, and how do we know that? And we go through that process to ensure that the activities really align to the outcomes that the project says, or the applicant says that they're going to achieve. And in some instances, in fact, in many instances, there'll be variations or levels as to which those set of activities may strongly align to or align to those particular outcomes. The next assessment criteria, so assessment criteria 3, is aiming to reach the right type of young people. Obviously, this was slightly extended for grant round 2 because this was also looking at aiming to reach the right type of young people and families in many cases. So I think that's important to note. And again, we do kind of flex some of these assessment criteria to ensure that they're appropriate for each grant round. And if you remember, for this particular grant round, for us, this was ensuring that we were aiming to reach the right type of young people and families that required support against a set of unmet needs or requirements that they wanted or need support with for both the F and the project to be able to work against the desired outcome. So I think that's really important. And we needed to understand that actually the project was aiming to reach the families and young people that we're most interested in. The difference in this grant round, I think, is probably worth noting that this is probably one of the very few grant rounds that we appreciated. Some projects were likely to work with parents, and actually young people were more downstream, if that makes sense. So actually we'd work with parents, but with the knowledge that we're working with parents to change the child outcomes. So in this particular instance, that there was a slightly different approach to some of the other grant rounds that we've run before. But ultimately our goal was the same, and that's to shift some of the child outcomes in a positive direction that we were most interested in. The next thing that we really keen on in our 4th assessment criteria is likelihood to lead to change. So this really is, if the project was shown to be effective, if delivery was shown to be effective, is it believable that it can reach many more young people? So I don't know whether some of you remember one or two of the questions in the application form around if this was found to work brilliantly, how might you deliver this at scale or scale it up? And I think there was different options around, would you become a bigger organisation? Could you train other people? Would it be a case of changing policy? How confident are you in that? And this is really for us to understand, I guess, 2 things. How scalable and replicable is the project? That's really important, because if it can't be delivered anywhere else, if it can't be scaled up across England and Wales, if there is no way that it can be delivered by other people, or for you to be able to deliver at scale, then actually it may be that this project isn't something that is as strong as another project. And the reason for that is we, as a What Works Centre, are keen to look at change at scale using evidence-based programmes. So that's really important to us. If this can't be scaled up to be delivered to more young people or families, then actually it's not going to score as well as one or a project that is able to do that and able to evidence that. And we know this is challenging. This is a particularly challenging question and a challenging assessment criteria for people to meet. But really understanding how you thought that through and how that might work would be really interesting to us and useful to help us understand how the project may grow if found to be effective. We also do understand within that question or set of questions for this assessment criteria that some things may or may not be possible for the different types of organisations. So to give you an example, we know schools could never increase in size because of the nature of how a school works, but they may be able to share practice and train others to be able to deliver what they do, for example. So there's enough flexibility within that to understand whether it, as I said, is scalable, replicable, and sustainable is really important as well. Okay, so we've looked at a great plan. The next part of our assessment is really looking at the capability of the plan to be delivered and to be delivered well. So there are 4 assessment criteria within this section as well. The first one is likely to reach the right type of young people. So projects will have identified, as you would have seen in the previous slide, types of families and young people that they aim to work with and they aim to reach, or have been doing so because the project has already been working within that area. What we now need to know is, okay, well, how likely is it that you're able to actually work with those groups that you're most interested in, that we're most interested in? How do you recruit them? How do you retain them? What does engagement look like? And that's really, really important. And who do you work with to make that happen? So that's a really important kind of assessment question for us to understand. Okay, looks like you're willing and wanting and possibly already working with the right type of young people, but how do you intend to reach them and maintain that reach throughout the life course of your project? The next assessment criteria is around able to deliver. So are you likely to be able to deliver the plan you have laid out? So again, many of the questions that link to this assessment criteria around risk assessment and identifying things that may prevent you from delivering well. This criteria also looks at the support and training and qualifications of staff and the infrastructure in and around staff. So are they qualified to do what they need to do? What support and supervision do they have in place to ensure that they can continuously develop and deliver well in the right way to the types of families and young people we were interested in for this particular round? And there are many other kind of criteria within that as well. So really asking you to identify what are your main risks? What do you know your main risks are to the project? And we know that every project has risks. And that's part and parcel of how you manage those risks. What's important to us is really identifying what are your mitigations and management strategies that you have in place. And we also recognise that young people and families that we work with are, you know, very, they have a number of unmet needs. They could be high risk or medium risk, depending on some of the grant rounds we're working on. And we know that they're often hard to reach groups. So we know that there are challenges here, but being really clear about what those challenges are and how you support people coming into your programme, the programme being delivered well, and for you to be able to manage those risks is really important to us. The next one is around evaluability. So can we evaluate what you do? So if you remember, for this particular grant round, we split up 4 types of programs. So that was parent education and training, family therapy, domestic abuse interventions, and parental conflict interventions into 2 groups. Group A, which was our parent education and training programs and our family therapy programs, we knew that we had a reasonable evidence base, a reasonably strong evidence base, both outside of the UK, but also in part within the UK. So we could work with projects who were slightly more advanced, underpinned by reasonably strong evidence already, that we could take a more robust evaluation approach to, ideally going into some form of what we call impact evaluation, which would be something like an RCT or a quasi-experimental design. RCT is a randomized controlled trial. For Group B, which was our parental conflict interventions and also our domestic abuse interventions, we know that there's still work to do in terms of building that evidence, and it's not quite as robust as Group A. So we were prepared to say that actually we could take a step back and start off at the lower rung of evidence to be able to start to build that evidence base in the way we wanted to for Group B. So really understanding how valuable the particular programs were or the projects were aligned to that strategy was really important for us. And then finally, able to be able to deliver at the required scale. So projects were asked to identify the number of families or young people and or families and young people that they were going to reach throughout the life course of the project. And we had those numbers and figures in there. And then we also asked about how you were going to deliver at scale. And that's particularly important because we could see what had been delivered previously and also understand what did that mean in terms of your ability to reach the numbers you were interested in for this particular project. How likely were you to do that? Had things such as dropouts, number of dropouts or attrition within your project or program been taken into account and I guess mitigated against to some extent within your project, or were you aware of those issues and how you might best manage those? So that's our grant round assessments in terms of the 8 criteria, and we use those across our grant rounds. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to move into another slide which looks at our commitment to equality, so you can understand how we take this assessment in context of some of the things that we care a lot about and that we really need to focus on as a what works centre that covers England and Wales, especially one that also works within the space of youth crime and violence. And then I'll go on to some specific feedback. Annie, can I check that is there anything in particular that I can answer at this stage, or should I crack on?
No, you can carry on.
Fantastic, thank you. So one of the things I also wanted to show is how we make our decisions in the context of our commitment to equality and what does that look like. So we know, working within the sector that is focused on youth crime and violence, that we have a number of marginalised groups which are disproportionately represented within the system. And we have a commitment to ensure that we're able to unpack that more and understand that more and tackle that. So one of our really strong commitments that we have is to ensure that we reach marginalised young people and understand how we can engage them and families within our projects to understand more about how we can support them through our programmes and the types of programmes we're most interested in, which are often the programmes that historically don't reach marginalised groups well. So actually understanding what that looks like and seeing if we can overcome some of those challenges is really important to us. So where projects were able to talk about working with marginalised groups, how they would do that, having track record, that was of real interest to us because these are areas we're really committed to. Of course, we also made a commitment to being able to evaluate and therefore fund projects that crossed each of the 4 areas that we were interested in. So those 4 programme types that I talked about. Again, just to go through those, family interventions, parental education and training interventions, parental conflict, and also domestic abuse interventions. We also try and ensure that our decisions have a reasonable, our granting decisions ensure that we have a reasonable spread of projects across England and Wales. And what does that mean in terms of hotspot areas for crime? What does that mean in terms of our commitment to covering England and Wales also? So we always have that in the back of our mind as well. And also we are keen to understand, and I'm sure you'll remember some of the questions that we'd ask at the beginning of the application around projects that are led by Black, Asian and minority ethnic leaders as well. There is some evidence to say that there are reasonably strong correlations between projects who are led by Black, Asian and minority ethnic leaders and their ability to reach or support the communities that we're most interested in and those marginalised young people. Okay, so moving on to the next part of the presentation, which is specific to Grant Round 2. So how could applications improve? And here will be, I guess, some of the main areas where we saw some really strong applications and areas where we could probably have done with a little bit more information or clarity, and therefore some areas where projects did fall down slightly within our assessments. As I said, just again to reiterate, these are observations that we made across all of our assessments. These are common themes that we were able to pick up and understand broadly. Where did people do really well, and broadly where did they lose marks? So if you remember to the criteria that we spoke to before, what I've tried to do is ensure that this feedback aligns to the specific criteria, so you can see where projects were stronger or did less well, and then to give relative examples of that as well. So the first criteria that was an area where applications did less well was around that likelihood to reach the right type of young people. So having that really clear narrative of knowing how they were working with or intended to work with children and young people and families with unmet needs, those that we were most interested in, specifically those that increase the likelihood of becoming involved in violence and crime. And we really wanted to know what the mechanisms around reaching those young people were. So who are you working with, and being really clear about who you want to work with and recruit into your projects. How are you going to do it? So if you've said that actually 75% of the families and children you're going to work with are from a BAME background, how do you know that? How do you work with partners, referral partners, to ensure that you are reaching the right types of family and young people as set out by your programme? So how will you monitor that? How will you also work with the right organisations to make sure that the participation of the groups you're most interested in is working and working well? And what does that mean in terms of retention and engagement within your project throughout? So really understanding those processes is where some applications, were much stronger than others, and areas where a number of applications did less well and lose marks within those areas. And these are things that we're really keen to understand. In particular for Grant Round 2, we know that referrals, engagement, attrition, dropouts are all things that projects have to work really hard on in the family space or a parental space for this grant round. And I think it was really important for us to really have those recognised and understand track record in working with key statutory organisations, community-based organisations, working with marginalised groups, understanding how you do that, and knowing whether you're on track or not was really important. We have provided an example, and I think this probably just builds on what I've just said. So an application, for example, may have said, okay, yeah, we're going to work with social services to identify families. But actually what we needed to know is from the outset, how do you get your referrals from social services? How does your social worker know that service is available and that they can refer people into your project? And what does that look like? How are people informed about your projects? And what is the consistency to ensure the referrals are right and ensure that you are able to impart the knowledge around perhaps the referral criteria as well? And what does that look like? Are there formal partnerships? Are they partnerships that you've had before? And are you able to show that they work and work well? And if so, what is your evidence for that? And then equally, if they're new partnerships, just identifying how you intended to set those partnerships up. We know it takes time to have those new partnerships, but how do you intend to work in that space? And if it's a hybrid approach, i.e. a mix of existing partnerships and new partnerships, how would you have intended to make those work and work well to ensure that you were reaching the right type of young people and ensuring that you were able to engage them within the project for the long term or as far as possible? And this type of detail really strengthened the applications, and they were the strongest applications that tended to move through to the next stage. So the next area to move on to in terms of where applications did less well, and it is a tricky area, and this is around the 7 criteria, so around being kind of evaluable. So what does that look like from a application perspective, and where did, I guess, applicants score really highly and less highly? And I hold my hands up. This is really challenging to answer the question, or set of questions that we have within our application form. I guess there's two broad areas within this criteria that projects did either really well with, so the stronger projects that move through to the next stages, or where people lost marks on. So having standardized projects, manualized type projects, are clear programs with the same or similar enough delivery for children and families that we are able to we are able to evaluate it in the way that we need to. So I guess there's several things to unpick here. The first thing is real clarity of what was being delivered. What are the core components that would be clearly being delivered as part of the project, and how and when and what does that look like? So having a clear vision for someone who doesn't know your project to be able to read the question around describing your activities and really understanding, well, what does this set of activities look like? If I start here, where do I go next? What then happens next? Who receives that? Who supports that? And really understanding that process. Where projects did really well also is those that focused on clarity or a smaller number of activities. So there were some projects that seemed to have some really good ideas, but there were around maybe 5 or 6 or 7 arms of activity. And that can be really difficult to know who gets what and when and what that looks like. But there were also some that maybe had 2 or 3 arms of delivery, but we could identify if there was a specific pathway that we were most interested in, and reach out to those projects to see whether that would be something they would be prepared to work with us on, rather than necessarily all 3 arms. So again, that was really important, that clarity of what was being delivered, understanding if I was to deliver in where I am now in Surbiton, would somebody in Preston be able to pick up a manual or have training to ensure they're able to deliver it consistently enough for young people and families to get a similar enough experience that the project is able to be evaluated in the way we would need it to be evaluated. And I guess just to pick up on the bold statement there, the same for every child, it's, I would say, similar enough for every child, because every child and family may have slight tweaks to certain things around the edges, but the core components that they follow are similar enough, and we can understand what that looks like and see that pathway or set of pathways that family and young children would go through. I guess then underpinning that is understanding what existing evidence is there for your project. So this also feeds into criteria 2 that you will have seen a few slides back, which was looking at if delivered well, how likely is it to achieve its outcomes? And this kind of feeds into criteria 7 as well, which is understanding what evidence is there to say already that this project either has promise or has worked previously in different contexts or circumstances. So where projects were stronger is that they were able either to draw on existing evaluations that they've been involved in, evaluations that have been conducted in the UK. Some haven't been conducted in the UK, but they may have been conducted in, I don't know, North America, for example, or Australia, and they were able to cite some of those and talk about that there is potential there, but we have to test it in a UK setting or an England and Wales setting. And they were able to articulate that. Others may have been able to, or were able to, pull on maybe academic literature or other literature, and also potentially some of these reports or evaluations that have done before to say, although this hasn't been done specifically on this project, there's enough similarities to suggest that this project may work well. again, dependent on the type of project that you were applying for. So if it was in Group A, where the applications were focused on family therapy, parental training and education, we expected that evidence base to be stronger. So you would have been able to draw on that, either your own or within the sector, to really understand the strength of evidence we would expect to see to be able to determine whether there was a real strong underpinning of theory and evidence for your project. For those in Group B, we did understand that I would be slightly weaker in terms of that evidence base, and there may be more inferences that needed to be made from academic literature or like projects that have been delivered before. But again, that ability to be able to draw in evidence and information from various sources to say, we do generally believe that there is promise that these activities, if delivered well, will achieve these outcomes. Or could achieve these outcomes, and this is the supporting evidence to suggest what that looks like. Understanding what that evidence looks like in terms of being able to report the levels of robustness, I think, is really important. So what do I mean by that? Being able to provide things such as pilot studies, so maybe where there was pre-post measures that were delivered, and being able to show the results of those evaluations is really important, whether they be internal evaluations or independent evaluations. For others, it may be that a randomized control trial was delivered in the States or even in this country, but to a different cohort or population of young people, and there's more testing to still do. So there's different kind of levels and sources to pull from. And it would be probably really helpful if you look at the EIF's 10 steps to evaluation success. And you can see here what these 10 steps are. This shows you the different types or levels of evidence that can be used to inform whether you believe your project is promising or whether there's a decent level of evidence that is already underpinning your project itself. I would say there's other things that can help you with that, because the 10 steps, whilst useful, I do also understand may be quite technical as well. But the EIF guidebook is quite useful, because again, it gives you guides around the types of projects or programs that have been delivered within this particular space. And it will potentially do similar things for other areas that we're interested in, should it cover or should the areas that we're interested in align to the scope of the EIF guidebook. But of course, we also have our own toolkit, which is why we try and suggest that people look at our toolkit, although it's worth noting that our toolkit is also developing, so we're developing this toolkit as we go. There will be evidence that you can refer to on that toolkit to understand what do we know so far and what does that mean for your project. Again, just to give you a bit of an example that we had here. So talking about standardized projects and how best to kind of present those. So looking at, for example, a 12-week program of parenting training for families who've been referred by a social worker, or over 10 weeks, parents and carers meeting for 2-hour group sessions. So just being really clear on what those activities are, what the intensity of those activities are, how much of those activities they're going to get, and who delivers those is really important. And again, just to reiterate, it's just really important that delivery is similar enough across families and young people, so we can evaluate it and understand whether a difference has been made. And then the final area that I'd like to present to you, which is an area where some projects scored less well on or lost points on, was around their ability to deliver at scale. And again, as I suggested a bit further on or earlier on in the presentation, this can be really tricky to discuss how to deliver at scale and understand what we're looking for. But I guess the biggest thing for us is if the number of young people and families you're intending to reach has increased, which was the case in many cases for applications, understanding how you'll be able to recruit many more families and young people is really, really important. So is it the fact that you've got really strong relationships with referral agencies? Do you have more than one referral mechanism, and what does that look like, and how does that align to ensuring that we're reaching the type of young people and families we're most interested in? What other partnerships do you have outside of statutory organisations? Or are there other mechanisms that you have considered? Are there new partnerships you're putting in place, and how will you ensure that they will work well to enable you to deliver at scale? And if they are new, what are you putting in place to give yourself enough time to be able to set those up? And broadly, giving yourself enough time to work with your partners to be able to deliver at scale. What does that mean, and what does that look like? So they were some of the things that we were particularly interested in when looking at being able to deliver at scale.